Mindset Athlete podcast, and I'm your host, James Roberts. I'm a two-time Paralympian and owner of James Robert Fitness, which is an online training, nutrition, and mindset coaching business. First of all, I'd like to thank Lauren Williams for suggesting this quote to the show. An athlete is a mindset. It's how you prepare, think, and execute. Not because of some elite status or physical stature. Anybody can be an athlete. By Chris Harth. And each week on the Mindset Athlete, we like to bring you inspirational athletes, a message, or experts talking about human optimization to teach you how to change your perception of your mindset and become 1% better. And on today's show, I've got Danielle Allen. She coaches high-performance athletes how to leverage their concussion symptoms for max performance and a better life. So welcome onto the show, Danielle.
Thank you for having me.
So obviously we were talking before we started recording, and you said that you had a number of concussions, obviously upward of 11.
Mm-hmm.
How, and in terms probably for the audience, how can you actually be able to visualize it in yourself and be aware of those symptoms, because they're going to be massively variant to determine.
That's literally the major focus that we have is how to see the symptoms in yourself. So for me, I kind of experience it's like if you've had one too many drinks and you think you're fine, but all of your friends are like, you're not fine. So you might be thinking that you're presenting well, that you're speaking properly, or you don't have any memory problems, but people around you are kind of like, are you okay? You don't sound right, or you either are presenting as more emotional or moody. You're walking slower, you're talking slower. So within kind of my span of concussions, I actually started to recognize the pattern in myself, whether I was, having active concussion symptoms or I was okay. And what was kind of the interesting thing is I think after concussion number 5 is when I was like, I actually do see a difference between me being concussed and me being not concussed. So I'm going to start writing down all of those symptoms, tracking my mood, tracking what I'm eating, and seeing how, what are the changes that I'm experiencing myself. And I actually did that based on the types of concussions I had. And then how long the recovery was for each one of those. So probably I've got about 3 years worth of information on how my concussions or what happened, what were the symptoms. Cause I think the biggest thing is a lot of people don't know other symptoms. If you've had multiple concussions, a lot of the information is based on one concussion. But after you have multiple, you start to pick up more symptoms that are not kind of in the baseline neuroscience kind of jargon. So that's kind of what I was finding. I was like, oh, this is not listed anywhere. So that was kind of the biggest thing for me.
But on a spectrum, Danielle, in terms of the severity of a concussion, obviously people will associate them with combat sports, collision sports.
Yeah.
But what on the other end of the spectrum, what in terms of to constitute a brain injury could be minute?
Yeah, so the minutia is really fascinating for me. If not even in combat sports, which was kind of crazy, motocross, for example, as I've been starting to get into guys who ride bikes and BMX stuff, it's small impacts over a long set of time. All of a sudden, these guys are having the same kind of symptoms as NFL players, and it's a completely different sport. So the crazy thing for me is trying to find those symptoms in minute impacts. So the biggest thing that I look for is, all right, so what were you doing? How much is your head jostling around? I don't think people realize how temperamental or moody the brain is or can be. So I've been doing research on like hydration or dehydration. So if you're, dehydrated, your brain starts to actually lose cognitive function the same way, like if you didn't sleep for 24 hours. So that like being, 70% dehydrated or even 30% dehydrated, you are reacting slower. Your speech can be affected. Your memory can be affected. And so I look at that to say like, that's just dehydration. That's just not getting enough water. So like if you compounded, dehydration plus you got, bumped in the head, now you're looking at multiple factors that can start impacting your brain. And that's kind of where I petition my athletes to start really recognizing, do you have a headache? Are you feeling a little cranky? Are you super tired? Those things can kind of come up without, getting completely knocked out. And so kind of changing the literature around how we think of concussions. There was the NFL series. It was called All Jacked Up. And all they did was show people just getting hammered on the football field. And like literally they're knocked out. Same thing with MMA. We do like the biggest knockouts. But what people kind of forget is like, if you get a bunch of little impacts, they make a big impact over time. So really trying to get people to recognize that even some of the smaller stuff that they think is not important is really playing a big role in their brain health.
But in terms of those little small things, what can constitute some of that actual misnomers, and people just skim over the fact, it's a little bit.
Oh yeah. So one of the things, like, somebody I've had people come up and be like, oh yeah, I think I've had a concussion before. Some people will be like, yeah, I got hit in the head and started seeing stars, but I didn't lose consciousness. So it's kind of those things of understanding, like getting hit in the head or having like a whiplash is a big one. People will get whiplash and not understand that even though their head didn't physically impact anything, their brain actually impacted inside of their head. So that's called it's a coup-counter-coup concussion. And those are actually some of the worst because it causes brain shearing. So in terms of that, I say, like, if you have like actively hit your head on something, or if, you had like a really bad case of whiplash, those can be considered minor TBIs or MTBIs, minor brain damage. And so it's kind of tricky because neuroscience actually hasn't caught up to categorizing that as an actual injury. A lot of times it's like, oh, did you lose consciousness? If you lost consciousness, like, wow, yeah, you should really take note. And even if you get back up and you're like, I'm fine. No, there's something in your brain that told you to like shut down. So that's kind of one of the things that bringing in the research to kind of get to that minutia is kind of tricky. So when I'm talking to people, I'm looking at, how they notice certain things. So for oftentimes people were like, well, I don't think I've had a concussion, but I sleep a lot. I'm really cranky for some reason. I get headaches all the time. So it's like all these little symptoms where the symptoms can actually be the same, even though they haven't had something dramatic happen to them. So that's kind of where it's a lot of almost talk therapy with a lot of these athletes to be like, all right, you don't think you've had a concussion, but you're having all of these different symptoms that would point to a concussion. And so it's kind of really making sure the language around symptoms is more accurate and more precise. And that kind of goes back to awareness. It's like most people have probably had a concussion or so, but don't even know. And so one minor concussion is okay. But if you're talking to athletes who've had dozens of minor concussions, that over time will affect their cognitive function, will affect their relationships. So it's really trying to make sure that we're changing the language around minute concussions, or like kind of smaller brain traumas. That way people can understand that if anything's wrong, if they're getting any symptoms, like understanding that symptoms mean that there's something wrong with your brain. Your brain can't feel pain. So if you're having, mood swings is a big one. If you're weirdly irritable, that means that something in your brain is telling you, hey, you should probably slow down. You should probably stop because we're not fine. So that's kind of the biggest thing for me, is trying to help people understand that, you don't need to be laid flat on your back and not remember the last 10 minutes for you to have a concussion. So yeah, it's mostly, I would say, in terms of that minute stuff, really honing in on having that athlete be aware of what they're already experiencing and then defining what that could be.
But in a nutshell, Danielle, do you think it's because, to some extent, concussion is to a certain extent stigmatized because in some of these sports you have to portray a certain sense of bravado, a certain sense of ego to carry on?
Oh yeah. And it's really transforming this idea of like, your concussion might be seen as like a badge of honor, like, oh, he got knocked out or she got knocked out and got back up and kept on playing. Like, that looks cool in the short term, but we're now finding like these rugby players, NFL athletes, motocross guys, they're having suicidal ideation. They're depressed. They don't have the proper short-term memory. And so it's really kind of, the trajectory is them becoming a vegetable, kind of sort of, where they're not able to care for themselves. And so, in the short term of like, oh yeah, I've got like 10 concussions, it sounds really cool, but you don't want to be in your 50s and have to have a caretaker. So it's kind of that trade-off of like having athletes understand the long-term repercussions of brushing it aside, and having them interact with athletes who have done that sort of thing and have been like, yeah, I've had, multiple concussions, whatever. Have them meet somebody who's in their 50s and has serious kind of symptoms, early on-stage Parkinson's, and they're like, oh, that doesn't look good. In my Instagram, I talked about meeting Muhammad Ali. And so world-class athlete, poet, activist, and, just this amazing personality. And I met him almost a couple years before he died. And the weirdest thing was like, you're kind of talking to a shell. And if you get athletes who are, in their 20s, have this kind of invincibility complex, and you sit them in front of some of these guys who are kind of shells of their former self, it really does help integrate like, oh, that could be me. And so when we have now, the research to back this up, to be like, yeah, if you have multiple concussions, this is where you might end up. If we have that kind of solid set of research, it's really now up to those institutions, those professional rugby teams, those professional football teams, soccer as well, hockey, to be like, to have a part of their institution say, we know that getting concussed multiple times will lead to that. And so having the proper prevention long-term to really make sure their athletes have a place to go when they're like, hey, I actually am not feeling okay, is kind of the bigger thing, where I think a lot of athletes do harm because they try to brush it off and be like, I'm fine. And they'll do that until they're not fine. And it's usually too late until they're not fine, where they're having some really severe symptoms. And that was kind of me to an extent, where it took me sleeping like 18 hours a day to be like, I think something might be wrong. Where I would wake up at 1 p.m. I'd be awake for 3 hours. I'd go back to sleep, and then I'd wake up for dinner, and then I'd go back to sleep after that. And I did that for 3 months until I was like, think there might be something wrong with my brain. Because all of my friends were out and they were, doing fun stuff, and I was literally just sleeping. And so for me, it took having to actually experience not being able to keep up with my peers, like being isolated, not being able to have a normal life, to be like, I think I've done some damage to my brain. And so, getting, newer athletes who are in their early teens, late teens, and early 20s to be like, you don't want to have to get to that point where you have to stop yourself. If you're trying to, having to stop yourself, you're probably a little too late. Like, you've done a significant amount of damage already.
But you talk about that isolation there from the perspective of the concussion. What greater impact is that going to have on your mental health? Be it you were put in that position of you're not among your peers from that basis.
So that's actually one of the things that I coach upon, because it's kind of funny. You don't realize that everything in your brain, your body is all connected. And so it took me like several concussions to realize how interconnected all of these things were. So after I think my 7th concussion, started getting really weird panic attacks where I'd just be going out to lunch and all of a sudden I would just hysterically start crying. I thought the floor was melting. Like, I'd be hyper paranoid. And I was like, I can't go out in public. Like, I'm going to be that crazy person that like can't sit down and have a good lunch and like can't eat a sandwich without like having a complete meltdown. And so I was realizing how integrated your mental health is with your brain health. And I think it's kind of crazy because they're both very well stigmatized to be like, oh, if you have a mental health problem, you're not strong enough to, push through. But being able to realize that your brain in of itself is your mental health. They are very much connected. Understanding that like your nutrition and like your hydration levels affect your brain health, which affects your mental health. So for me, it was kind of seeing how all these different aspects were relating to each other. And it took me being isolated from my friends and family, lashing out like emotionally in a really dark place for me where I was like, it's interestingly enough, I talked to a lot of athletes, military vets as well, and they've experienced something where they get to a point where they no longer have an emotional response. They have this kind of like a sphere or bubble of apathy where they can't feel anything. And it's crazy because a lot of them, and myself included, have kind of said that's actually the worst symptom, is getting to a point where you feel nothing, like you're numb. It's scary because you don't have that, like self-preservation that's kind of instilled in all of us. Like, you could be like, I could walk out into traffic right now and really not care. So you don't care for your body, but there's still something in you that's being like, but I should. So it's that sort of isolation and mental health stigma that trying to get athletes who've experienced multiple concussions to understand how interconnected all of these things are, and realizing that, one of the things that people who want to stigmatize mental health say is it's all in your head. Well, if you've had a concussion, you've had a trauma to your head. So of course it's all in your head. Your brain is injured. You have a brain injury. So for me, that was kind of like the weird thing. I was like, well, yeah, it is all in my head. Like, I don't have control of my day-to-day life. And so coaching our athletes to realize, what's isolating about it is you're having these mental health kind of issues, but also you're having an identity issue because you're not able to, do or play your sport. And so that's the biggest thing, is like, now you've kind of isolated yourself from your friends, but you've also kind of isolated yourself from your sport. And so a lot of athletes are like, my purpose is my sport. You take away their sport, you've taken away their purpose. So that's kind of where I come in and be like, all right, we've got to separate, like, the athletic part of you, like, the spiritual part of you, like the family part of you, and be like, you might lose your sport, but you have to you have to rebound from that. And that is really much like a mental health sort of thing, where people don't realize that, if they keep on pushing, they might lose their sport in the long run. So it is interesting, from kind of where I've started and just kind of interviewing and working with different athletes, just how integrated it all is, and how I can see the pattern in talking to like the first 5 athletes that I talked to. I see the pattern of, they are scared of losing their sport. And further than that, they're kind of scared of losing themselves. So there is kind of this weird identity thing where you see after multiple concussions that who you are is changing. You might become like grumpier, more angry, more moody, and that's not who you used to be. So there is this really difficult transition for a lot of those athletes to kind of step back and, have a wider perspective on, what their life is. So it does get really mental, very spiritual when I'm talking to people, because they do kind of have an identity crisis, because they're realizing that these concussions are virtually changing who they are as a person. So yeah, overall, it really does encapsulate a lot of mental health.
But if you looked at it from maybe I won't say a positive perspective now, a different perspective, and looked at it in this sense of a certain growth mindset, adaptability, flexibility, nothing's supposed to be rigid and in one sense. So if you could accept your personality is always ever going to change. It's going to change throughout your entire life. So you can come to terms with, be it, I would say, probably the negative side of sport, that this is going to arise.
Oh yeah.
You probably are not very observant to it, because it's like, well, I'm changing. I see myself day to day.
Yeah.
You see that with any aspect of, be it appearance and whatever. It's only the people from an outward perspective that can relate that information back to you. You've changed, etc. But be it for the better or for the worse, because you as the person are living it. So you don't per se know that. But in terms of this notion of numbness, what do you think people need to do? And obviously, when you're in a state of, obviously, you could say darkness, rock bottom, in that place of dread, what can you do to alleviate? And obviously, is it being more aware of those symptoms as they progress, and to not put yourself in that position?
Yeah. So what the course that I've kind of created thus far is really to make a course that can be done when you're at your like rock bottom. So really, like, what's the bare minimum you can do to help yourself progress? And really the first thing that we teach people is it is in sort of a meditative practice, where your goal for like the first couple of days is to just note and observe how you are feeling. And so you don't really give a lot of emotion to how you're feeling. So for example, if you have one day that you're feeling completely dead inside, you're feeling completely numb, you'll write down, you'll say like, I'm dead, I'm feeling numb today. That's it. That's like the rock bottom. It's just having that awareness that you're feeling those things is the first step really to be able to kind of get back to a sense of normalcy. And what I find is that people have not done that in the past. They don't really have our schools don't really teach us how to, be aware of our own emotions. And so kind of what you're saying in terms of that mindset thing is like, you actually now do have to learn a different strategy to help your brain, to help like your emotion, to be emotionally stable. You have to have that awareness. If you're feeling depressed and even suicidal, you're like, all right, I'm feeling depressed today. I'm feeling a little bit suicidal. And that's the stigma, is like, you can't say that out loud. Like, oh no, she's feeling suicidal. Like, let's call in like 18 billion people and get her on the phone with 8 different psychiatrists. no, we're fine. To be able to say that and not act either way, not say it's good, not say it's bad, just be like, yeah, this is what I'm feeling. It helps athletes, even just general people in general, to figure out, this is my emotional state. It's not good or bad. And that's how you kind of get to like the next step, like, or level 2. Because a lot of times people will panic. I found when I did personally, when I first started experiencing a lot of the ranges of symptoms, I was like, oh no, what's wrong with me? I'm blah. And panic doesn't help, because the next time you feel it, you're actually rewiring your brain to feel that same panic every single time that happens. So for me, when I got overwhelmed, I was kind of creating a neuropath, like a path in my brain to be like, you're oversensitized, like you have too much stimulus, go straight down into panic attack. So that was kind of the links that my brain was creating. It was like, oh no, there's too many people in this crowded space, have a mental breakdown. And so what was crazy is I started getting a fear of going into public spaces, because I was like, am I gonna freak out? Like, am I gonna have a panic attack? And as soon as I had that brain shift of being like, all right, I feel overstimulated. What can I do to not feel overstimulated? It kind of lost its, the panic attack itself kind of lost its weight, because I would still maybe have a panic attack, but I was like, and now we're having a panic attack. It's okay. And I'd, kind of wait it out, get back to normal, come back to my friends and be like, all right, just had a panic attack. No big deal. And what was crazy was kind of this cognitive behavioral therapy for myself to kind of understand you can go through X, Y, and Z and not assign emotions to it. Because as soon as you start assigning emotions to it, you're teaching your brain, if you feel this, then do that. Your brain is going to make a shortcut regardless of whether you want to or not. So to get athletes in a space of like, if you're feeling really low and in a dark place, don't panic. And it's counterintuitive, because a lot of times that's what people want to do, is like, they're like, oh, I want to panic because I feel in a certain way. That's been the most helpful thing for myself and for others, is to really have a sense of observation. And that's what my first step for working with new athletes, for my advice for other athletes is like, if you're feeling a certain way, just observe it. And it actually does take practice to be able to observe it, because your brain has already said, oh, if I feel this way, I should panic, or I should be really fearful. Or for me, I would just go to sleep for 18 hours. I was like, we're overstimulated, just sleep for the day. So that would be, the biggest shift is to kind of separate your emotions from what's actually happening in real time, just for that sake of mental health.
But then also, Danielle, in terms of, and this is probably how it's arisen, this episode, is I was asked by somebody else who's suffering with concussion at the moment, and they've been given, how would I put this? Be it like limit time, be it obviously away from the computer, TV. What's the connection between concussion and light sensitivity?
Yeah, so it's funny how, as we're kind of going into this age of technology, that folks, neuroscientists, computer engineers even, are realizing your brain it works on electrical impulses. And so, if you just even think about magnets, you have a magnet on one side of the table, a magnet on the other side of the table. As they get closer together, they either repel or retract. And so when you kind of think about your brain as an electrical source, that actually means it's also working as a magnet. And so people have never really thought about the idea that your, overhead lights, your computer screens, your cell phone, have negative or positive impacts on your brain, because the frequencies we can't really perceive. It's above our, visual or sound impulses, but it still affects us. So in terms of like, limiting computer time, yeah, you should definitely limit your computer, phone, even music, I'd say. A lot of athletes have problems listening to music because it's a stimulus of a sort. So the research is kind of now coming out in terms of how all these different lights affect your brain, but one of them is blue lights. In particular, the frequency of blue lights really messes with your circadian rhythms, because if you think about it, like, what color is the sky? The sky is blue. And we have a tendency not to really understand how our brains are based on nature. And we've kind of gotten into the shift of society where we're inside all day, we're staring at computer screens. So we've kind of replaced all of the natural things with artificial things. So your brain is like, I see blue light, it's daytime. Except now it's 12 o'clock at night or it's midnight and you're trying to go to sleep and your brain's like, well, it's daytime. Why should I go to sleep? So you're messing with your sleep cycles, your circadian rhythms by, introducing different lights and things of that nature. And taking one step back further, that means you're messing with your brain chemistry. Your brain is now having to rewire itself to be like, all right, so now it's still light at midnight, which means we should be awake. So I should be making the awake hormones to keep you awake instead of your adenosine hormones, which, will help you fall asleep. And so it's very interesting in terms of a lot of the studies right now are being done on mice and how we introduce different types of light to mice and looking at brain chemical markers. And so, in short, our technology is kind of changing and rewiring our brains for better or for worse. And so for me, having, a lot of visual stimuli would actually create my panic attacks. So if I was working on the computer for more than 3 hours, if I went, 3.5 hours on the computer, my brain would be like, all right, it's time to shut down, and I'd have a panic attack. So people haven't drawn the line that your computer, your phone, your, internet, radio, whatever, those are stimuluses that do affect your brain chemistry, because it just seems like it's an everyday thing. And so what you're talking about with, mindset and, shifting for good or bad, when you have a concussion, it actually kind of takes you back to step one, and you're now kind of having to rewire and shift things that you thought were good for you or thought you were normal. You're like, oh, that's actually harming my brain in a sense. So even if you haven't had any concussions, blue lights affect you. When you do have a concussion, you see to what extent it can affect you. And so now you actually have to be aware and take better precautions on how to move forward with these things.
But what strategies could you actually implement beyond those, though?
So one of the things that I use on my computer is it's called Flux, the Flux app. And so instead of blue light after 6 p.m., it changes my computer screen orange. Some people get glasses that are legitimately orange glasses. And so while you're looking at your computer screen, it doesn't look blue. It looks like a weird dingy orange color. It takes a while to adjust to, but I found that my eyes weren't as tired because, if you're staring at a computer screen for a couple hours, you get off and you start blinking weirdly, and your eyes kind of hurt and you're like, oh, that's not good. So that was one little step that I took. I try to make little small habits and changes. So I wouldn't check my phone or my laptop after 8 p.m. And it's interesting because I had to get a little more militant with a lot of these habits, getting a lot more regimented of all right, so I can't have my phone in my bedroom as my alarm clock. I know a lot of people use their phone as their alarm clock because I might check it. I might, get up in the middle of the night, check it, have this bright blue screen, beaming into my eyes at midnight. So little things like that where I'm I don't have my electronics in my bedroom. Those are small steps. In terms of television, I limit my television time. Binge watching is a big thing now. If you've had multiple concussions, maybe don't binge watch several episodes of television. because it's just a lot of stimuli for your brain to take in. And even if you haven't had multiple concussions, like maybe just go on a walk. So really understanding time limits. I like put timers on things all the time. I'll set phone reminders and be like, all right, like my phone has like a screen time app. So it shows me how long in hours I've been on my screen. And I've set it to like, if it's more than 3 hours in this set period of time, then like you should probably do something else. So it's a lot of just little things that, you know, you can like little steps and actions you can take to be able to limit, you know, screen time, phone time, radio. People who live in big cities, it's kind of tricky, like going out at night. There's just a lot of like screens and a lot of lights and everything's flashing. It's like being like New York and Times Square. You probably don't want to be there. It's not good for your brain. So I really try to tell people, you know, that's where that awareness comes in. You have to be aware of your environment and how your environment is affecting you. If it's having a negative effect or positive effect, you have to make your own treatment plan that works best for you. So some people really aren't affected so much by light stimulus, but it might be sound. Or food is a big one. Salty food, sweet, spicy, doesn't matter. They might have more of symptomatic reactions with their brain by the foods that they're eating, if they're eating dairy or something like that. So that's kind of where I'm like, only you know the symptoms that you're having. So you have to take the precautions necessary to kind of do the best, or at least do no harm for the rest of your brain.
But Danielle, in terms of this awareness, how does one, I'm going to use this term loosely, learn it without getting to that stage of what we talked about hitting rock bottom, where you have to rewire yourself anyway? How do you get to this position where you're aware of the situation and you've not been taught that in the first place?
Yeah, that's literally what we help train people to do. It's interesting because, you know, nowadays you'll hear a lot on like mindfulness apps and meditation apps and like this, that, and like you have breathing timers. And so people are roughly becoming aware. Yoga is a big one of these different ways to become a little more aware, but it hasn't quite been integrated in terms of mental health and concussions. So, you know, you have these things. And I think that one of the problems is, you know, for the mindfulness and yoga apps that here in the States, it's kind of become trendy. And so it's like, oh, now we have goat yoga. And so people kind of laugh at it and they're like, not doing that. That sounds dumb. But there is actually, you know, it's funny because we've, in terms of meditation, we've been doing it for thousands of years. And now research is like, meditation is actually really great for your brain. So, you know, for a lot of people, understanding like there is a part of it that is super trendy, and people think like, oh, in order to be mindful, in order to meditate, I have to like sit and go Om for 30 minutes. Go on a walk without your phone, like preferably next to like in a park or next to some trees. That way you are limiting your stimulus. You're limiting your stimuli around you. Trees are great for that, to be like, all right, let's slow it down. And you actually kind of rewire your brain to become naturally aware. Because when you're going on a walk, you're naturally observing your environment and your surroundings in a way that is different than, you know, going for a run. You're going for a run, you're doing it for exercise, you're doing it, you're trying to hit mile times. You go on a walk and you're like, wow, it's really nice outside. Look at the birds. So little things like that in terms of like doing things that are slower in pace. I tell people, for me, it was art, painting. Do things that don't involve a computer or don't involve like fast pace. Like if you start to do things that help you slow down, you'll kind of naturally teach yourself to become more aware, because that's just naturally what you're going to practice. So for me, I started painting, sculpting. That was kind of the cool thing. I got my 6th concussion. I started painting. I was like, I don't know how to paint, but like these aren't half bad. Going out in nature, helps you slow down is the biggest thing. And because at least for people who've had multiple concussions or even one concussion, slowing down is like the best thing that you can do for your brain, because your brain is trying to rehabilitate and recuperate and recover itself. So it's going to do that naturally. If you slow down, you can help it do that faster. So a lot of people, I feel like, think they need their meditation practice has to look like, X, Y, or Z. I tell people, do whatever, is working for you. If you don't like going on a walk, do something else. But make sure, you are in a state of mind where you're not constantly fielding questions or constantly checking your email, or just you're kind of disconnecting. That's kind of the biggest thing for, at least for people in our society, is like they're very connected, and, work is emailing them and this is over here. And so that's, I feel like, the most helpful way, in terms of kind of trading that awareness part, is just be like, stop doing what you're doing and just like calm down, like be still. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that.
But I think, and I'll butt in, add some of, obviously, my own personal experience. I think I wouldn't have related the two together in terms of until we've actually spoken together. I dissociated probably concussion with the sporting sense, and then mental health has arisen not later life, but not more recently. And there's probably, off the top of my head, it's about 5 years removed between what I think, or maybe a little bit less. But I wouldn't put the two together in terms of until you said it. But I think with me, and you said slowing down pace, I think for me, I did photography, and it's getting that sense of, well, finding that something creative within yourself. In terms, I was quite good artist in high school, so I was like, well, don't want to do art because that's more, and that is slower in itself. Is even slower than picture. So I think maybe that's where I was able to probably take away some of the probably those little minute symptoms that you were talking about earlier in the episode, because it probably have arisen in early childhood, some of those just messing about. And you don't even think of that. It's like, well, you're messing around with your friends, taking a knock to the head, and that's probably the first one. But being able to take that step back, because it's built into the curriculum, you become accustomed to doing it anyway. So you just say, well, I'm quite good at that. You go into probably high school, you then do it as a class because you enjoy it. So you don't put the two and two together. You do it. I feel at ease. I feel relaxed. And it's probably been built into and hardwired into my DNA. I'm quite laid back. So I think that symptom of when you say it does occur, and it probably hit its heights with the mental health, it was, the counselor said to me, you were overdoing it and trying to balance too many plates in the air, thinking, I don't think so. And this was probably 6-7 months ago. But on reflection now, you're thinking, maybe I was trying to balance one too many things. He probably had a point in terms of that basis. I'll probably be, for me, was balancing too much at that particular time. But if I'd have probably taken one or two of those away within the confines of what I was used to, I'd have been okay with that. But that's very, very much like we're talking about, is awareness, be able to see that. At the time, you think, oh no, that's nothing. I need to get these things all done, but you don't think of what the consequences are going to be. So I think for me, and I'll wrap up my point, I think as I progressively got better and obviously did talk about the problems, and people just giving you suggestions to implement. It's like, okay, you could try this. Okay, I'll give it a go. If I don't enjoy it, I can do something else. And it's having that open-mindedness, I'd like to use the word, to at least attempt it. On some of those things, I thought, I've not liked them in the past.
So why would I?
Why would I like them? But then that's that argument I'm going to use was Pilates, and the difference between the general populace Pilates and what I did as an athlete is a massive gulf between the two.
Yeah, very different.
But I thoroughly enjoyed Pilates. I saw the other one as a necessity because I had to do it, but I wouldn't have done it out of choice. Or sometimes maybe I would have, but whereas this one, I see the needs must. I enjoy it. It's my time away from, well, the outside world, so to speak. And it's an hour of peace. I won't look at my phone. Okay, I will talk to people, but they're in a similar frame of mind that is either for relaxation, to a certain extent strength and conditioning, for whatever basis they're doing it, and they get an enjoyment out of it. So it's finding, like you say, a vehicle to be able to slow the pace down, get away from what is become the norm of everything must be now. It's everything at fast, but it's going in reverse. Yeah.
I mean, what's really crazy is our schools, and especially for athletes, we are super competitive. We're type A, super driven. It's like, go, 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 go. And so when I was in college, played Division I softball, we had our schedule, and then we had one built-in like NCAA mandatory rest day. And so that was literally to physically rest the body. But I remember everyone would get so like angsty on their rest days that it was never restful. They're like, I just, school and sports and stuff. And so all these athletes, I feel like, have really been trained to be like, go, 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 go. Like, you got to push harder. You got to train harder. You got to do this harder. And what's funny is we've kind of integrated a rest day for the body, but we've never integrated like a rest day for the mind. And so even if you haven't had a concussion, like even if you have like zero brain symptoms, whatever, like that's important. And so in terms of these activities, I feel like a lot of athletes have no idea how to turn that competitive nature off. So they'll try these things. They're like, I went on a walk and it wasn't restful. And I was like, well, I mean, you're competing with the grandma with the 5 pound little dumbbell weights. And like, you have to kind of disconnect from that competition side. It's not about whether you're good at it or not. I think a lot of them, a couple of the guys that I've been working with, they've talked about painting. They're like, I'm just not good at it. And I'm like, it's not about being good at it. Like, you don't have to have the best like sculpture or painting in the class. Like, it's not for you to become Picasso. It's like for you to like calm down. I'm like, so, if you're taking that really athletic nature of like, I have to be first, I have to be the best, I have to win in these mindset practices, it's really funny to me because I'm like, you're not doing it right. Like, you have to disconnect from, these preconceived notions that are really kind of ingrained in a lot of athletes of like, I want to win. Like, you're finally doing something that does not encapsulate winning. And a lot of them struggle with that of, if I'm not good at it, why should I do it? So it's actually kind of retraining them, and especially guys who are 27, 28 and going into their 30s, like 30 years of having a very driven and like go, go, go type A mindset to be like, calm down. And they really do struggle with that. And so, that's the bright side of concussions is they don't have a choice whether they have to like, there's no choice of like, should I slow down or should I, take a rest day? Like, their brain is forcing them to take a rest day. And so that's kind of the new shift that we're getting into with a lot of the athletes who've had multiple concussions, but just in general, a lot of the athletes that I talk to, I'm like, all right, so, you have a cardio rest day where, you're not doing as intense workout. Like, what is your mindset? Like, what's your mind's rest day? Like, what do you do to like take time off of your brain? And they're like, what? They don't even understand the concept of that. They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, what are you doing to give your brain a break? Like, your brain cannot be going like 24/7 pedal to the metal. Like, you're going to burn out. And that's the biggest thing that we find with a lot of these athletes is they were already burnt out before their their seventh concussion. And so they go back and they realize they're like, oh wow, I could have, been in such a better place before all these concussions if I had just like taken a moment to like breathe, and relax and calm down. And it's funny because even for the non-athlete, the research is coming out on just general cortisol and stress hormone levels in the natural population is just like an increasing upward line. It just like keeps on going up. And so they're like, the average person has like twice the amount of stress hormones they should be going through their body. And I'm like, oh, that's not good. And so you see it as burnout. You see it as people losing their hair. You see it as people gaining weight, mental health issues, simply because people are not giving themselves a break. And so I joke with a lot of my athletes. I'm like, your concussion was your break. You broke your brain, so you need to stop. And so that's kind of the positive side is they're actually now having to force themselves to take in more of a holistic method of athletic training. And it really does give a lot of the people, for myself included, more of an edge, because now I know how to be aware of when I'm becoming burnt out. I'm a firefighter right now, so it's not like I chose a very low stress job. I see when I'm becoming burnt out. I know what to do when that happens. And so I've now become a professional in terms of understanding how to handle stress in my environment, stress in my diet, stress in my mental health. I'm not worried. I don't panic when I see those things happening. I'm like, oh, these things are happening. I know what to do now. And I can get back to normal, get back to being able to compete a lot faster because I'm not, spinning my wheels. I'm not like, oh my gosh, like the sky is falling. Where I think a lot of athletes, if they haven't had a concussion, they'll get to that point eventually where they do get to a stage of burnout where they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just stressed. And I'm like, just take a moment, just breathe. You're fine. Because it is one of those things that hasn't quite been integrated into, I feel like, the sports world as much. It's kind of getting in there, but overall, especially with a lot of younger athletes, they're not getting that kind of training of like, yeah, your mind, your brain is a part of your body. That's your instrument as well. So you need to take care of it.
But in terms of, you raise interesting points there, Danielle, in terms of, the athlete needs to be, needs not to be, should I say, competitive, but needs to be first in one thing. But do you think they've lost sense of the initial endeavor they had at the very start of sport? Obviously, it's for fun.
Oh yeah.
That comes into it later on.
And I think that's, for a lot of people, it's crazy. In the news here, there was like a little league baseball game, and the parents, like, there was a bad call from like a 13-year-old umpire. The parents literally started brawling on the baseball field in front of these 13-year-old kids. And I was like, wow, that's a lot. That's special. Because I mean, even at 13 years old, like, the society around the sport is like, you need to be the best. Like, we got to win. And, people do lose fact of like, even professional athletes. I love working with professional athletes. I'm like, you play soccer for a living. Yeah. Like, you should, take some time and like, get back to the fact of like, that's pretty awesome. Like, that's a good place to be. But they do kind of get super stressed out by this burnout of like having to be the best all the time, where they literally forget, why they started or things of that nature. And for me, talking to a lot of my former teammates, when they go back to, the softball field, they're like, wow, this is great. Like, this is a really fun sport. Like, they forgot like, 10, 20 years of their lives. They forgot about that because they were, very much in that drive, competitive, like, I have to win mindset. And so it's interesting because, a lot of coaches might say like, well, this sport is fun. Like, winning is fun. And you're like, well, yeah, I mean, it is, but not if like you're miserable while you're doing it. So I think a lot of athletes will get to that point where like the sport becomes miserable, but they've been rewired and retrained in their brain to be like, well, my goal now is to win. Like winning is fun. And you're like, not really. Not if you're burnt out. Like not if you're super stressed. Not if you're tired all the time. That's not fun. And more than anything else, it's not healthy. It's not healthy for your long-term mental health. It's not healthy for your body. And I feel like it's good that people are kind of starting to realize that. But yeah, just like you say fun in certain practices, and people are like, fun? It's not about fun. And you're like, okay. So yeah. And that's kind of something that I do tell a lot of my athletes is like, actually try and play your sport, not to compete, not to get better, just to enjoy it, because that's something you enjoy. And so that's kind of one of the things that people will realize when they do disconnect from kind of like the society of their sport. They'll realize they're like, oh, this is actually kind of fun. Like I enjoy doing this. I'm like, yeah, that's why you started. So that's kind of the bigger thing that I try to like retrain into people, is trying to kind of get them back to center, or at least the reason why they started.
But I think in a nutshell, Danielle, I think it's reminding oneself, or not reframing. I'll use the word reframing to look at awareness as being a skill. It's something that you can acquire. Obviously, you may not have it. You can obviously the loose sense of the word. You can be aware of your surroundings. Be it some people are better at some are better than others in terms of probably like people watching. So they should in theory be able to take that step back and say, okay, I can observe this sense of I'll call it loosely nosiness a little bit. Take a step back and be kind of an outer body experience and look down upon myself and what could I do better. So I think it's obviously looking at it from that perspective in terms of looking at a skill, and what I wanted to add in terms of that skill set was when you said athletes, they want to be number one, be first from a competitive sense. When it comes to something, I'm going to say they're not particularly good at, be it painting, sculpting, and they put it from a competitive sense. But you're not, like you said, going to be a Picasso, but that is a skill that you have not, I'm not going to say not acquired, you've not accomplished yet. And I think due to the nature of you being competitive, if you feel it that's important to become good at it, you'll be able to do it. But it's putting that awareness into place from that basis to say, well, and this is you probably steal this from me, in terms of you've put hours and hours into your craft from a sporting perspective. That's probably where the general populace kind of struggle to say, well, I can't become you. Or you weren't willing to put in that
you're not
sacrifice.
10,000 hours.
It's not a sacrifice for me. That was it could go as far as an obsession, but the dedication and the willingness to want to do it is a no-brainer. I'll do it but then to summarize in terms of and come to my actual overall where I'm coming from, if you did the same in towards something else, you'd probably be good at that as well. But
I mean, and that's kind of the thing that's funny is for athletes, it's oftentimes they started because they enjoyed it, they're competitive, and they were good at it. So that's why they continued to get better. And then in terms of like understanding mindset as an actual practice, or mindfulness, meditation, even breathing practices, I feel like athletes do a lot better when they are moving in their meditation practices. So like yoga, Pilates, walking, sculpting, their brains kind of are at ease because they get to move so much. But that's kind of the funny thing. I'm like, yeah, you're probably going to be bad at it because you spent your whole lifetime like honing your cricket or football skills. Like, duh. So it is kind of funny the frustration, I think, where they're like, well, I'm just not good at my breathing exercises. I'm like, you breathe every day. Like, calm down. And so it is kind of this training, and that's why I call myself the concussion coach, because it is coaching people to understand. I'm like, you're maybe not, a master at this practice because you haven't put those hours in, but at the same time, like, understanding like this is a practice that goes beyond, the skills of your sport. A lot of the football players that I talk to, you don't have a lot of opportunities to tackle someone in like your daily life and just like public. Like, you're not just like, all right, like, it's not going to come in handy for you, but like maybe your breathing exercises will. And so having them understand that distinction of like, this is now a skill that you can apply a lot more broadly than just, getting on the line, hitting, your offensive or defensive lineman over and over again. It's a lot different. And so once they kind of get over that hump, like exactly what you're saying of like, oh, this is another practice, they get a lot better. And what's funny is I also have to tell them, it gets kind of very metaphysical in terms of like, you have to now be aware of your own frustrations in your walk to awareness. And so you just keep on like having to go back and be aware of all the things that are coming up. That way I tell people like, write them down. I'm really big at like doing the least. So I'll tell people like, if you don't want to get a pen and paper and write them down, grab your phone and put like an emoji for that day. Like, find an emoji and just be like, boom, that my emoji was like angry. And so at least now you have a way to track your progress, where, you might, try your breathing practice. You see like an angry emoji and you like see your breathing practice, another angry emoji. And then finally you're kind of, tracking yourself to become a little more helpful.
You raised a good point there, Danielle. So I had to look on my phone in terms of, because there was an app I was recommended to do to look from an emotional standpoint in terms of when I was dealing with, I say to some degree I still have mental health issues, but in terms of when it was magnified to where it was, and the app's called Dailyo, and you could go nuts if you wanted to in terms of going into everything between what you're feeling. But I looked at it in different components, be it I used to do it, be it how I felt going to work, lunchtime, after work, and then in the evening, and it'd be okay. The environments are slightly different. So okay, how do I feel in this environment now? I know it does remind me to do it from time to time. It's like, how do I feel today?
You're like,
I'll do it another time. It's not. It served a purpose to get me where I needed to get to, but I don't need to overanalyze it. And then there was time you talk about frustration. I overanalyze it. So, okay, why do I feel like this today? Yesterday it was better. And then it's like, I start feeling not guilty, but I feel worse because it's like, well, I'm comparing this to this. Last month was like that, but you show it to somebody else. Like, don't over. But I think for me, over time, you could relate it to, okay, you talked about it's an emoji, be it, I can't remember, it's like happy face. Oh God. I'll describe it as numbness, like a face of not showing any emotion. I think sad, and then there's like, I never got like the worst one on the app, but mine generally, it would be like my family likes to say like nothingness. It's most of the time you're in the middle. It's like, well, you can't be. What did I say the other day? I've got like bipolar traits, but she's like, my mum was like, no, you don't, because you're most of the time here. You're not you're extreme middle. Up here, and you're not down here all the time. Thinking, well, that might be now, but before it was there was extreme states for one. So for me, I would say I'm not recommending for people to do it, but I said, well, it gives you a sense to if you are feeling a state of low mood, you could at least track it, and then you could relate. But that's obviously I'm able to be aware now because of the app, to be aware of, well, okay, this is the trigger. What can I do about it? Okay, yesterday wasn't the best, be it work related. I'm aware of this situation is frustrating me. What can I do to not exacerbate the situation, but subdue the situation to make me feel better, and obviously give you the tools to I see the problem that is being given to me over social media, so I can't do anything. But let me give you the tools to, this is what I would do. I have at the back of the mind, it's probably where the frustration comes from. You're going to do the opposite, which it makes it worse. So I did have to say, okay, I've given you and I did speak to another colleague today about it. It's like, well, I've given you the tools, so I'm going to lift that weight off my shoulders, and I'm a lot better than yesterday in terms of it. So let me just slow down, concentrate on my breathing, and try and not control me, because I can't control that person's head. But get them to be aware of what you're doing. I knew that probably was going to rise. They told me that it did come about. I was like, well, I'm not surprised, because I've given you the strategy so that doesn't happen. You didn't take them. So some of the accountability's got to fall at your feet. Because I gave you the tools. I said this was going to be a problem because I saw it happening before it arose. But I think it's being aware of the fact that not taking, like you said, that situation and connecting to an emotional response, because obviously it's going to have a compounding effect.
And the couple of things that you brought up were really important, because like I don't really like lock myself down into any sort of like app or like practice. Whatever works. So for me, there was a time where I would, track all my moods and emotions and all that. And then I'd get guilty about not tracking it and be like, oh crap, I didn't track it for like this whole week. And what was actually happening is I was doing the tracking in like my daily life. Like I'd be like, oh yeah, that pisses me off, but okay, here we go. So I was taking the app and kind of integrating it into myself. And the transition was weird because I'm like, why am I so guilty? Because I didn't track this, that, or the other. It was because I was already like integrating it into my daily life and my habits. So I teach people, I'm like, there is a time where you actually might not need an app or to do X, Y, and Z. Like you're actually going to come up into a situation where you're doing all the things. You're just being like, all right, like I see this, I see this, I see this. That's happening. That person's stupid. That's okay. Like I can control what I can control. And so it's almost like taking off the training wheels in a sense of like, all right, we've gotten to a point where you're okay without, using this. And so that's kind of how I teach people in terms of how they level up, understanding that for me, I'm not so focused on the goal of tracking or whatever. It's more of the system of what it does for me. So when I was really at like rock bottom area, I'm like, that was like literally my whole lifeline. Like that is all I lived for, was to just track up, down, left, right, happy, sad. That's the only thing I did. And I got to a point where that became who I was, where I was like, oh, I can track these things and I don't need to pick up my phone because I just know that I'm feeling that sort of way. These are the reasons why. And so that was kind of the biggest thing in terms of translating that for other people to understand, is your brain sometimes is working so fast that, somebody says something, you don't really recognize it, but triggers you in the back of your head. And so you're going around and you're like, oh, I'm angry, but I don't know why. And then you remember, I'm like, oh, that guy back there, like, 3 hours ago said something that really made me angry. And I've just been like carrying that anger. And so that's kind of how the system kind of changes as you kind of go along, to be able to not need any sort of external whatever tool for you to be aware of like what's happening or what's going on. And then also to be able to take the steps to fix it in the moment. And so it's interesting. There are a handful of people that when I talk to them, they're very blunt and they need to settle things like now. And I'm like, maybe now isn't always the right time frame. Like you're heated, she's heated, like it's not a good time. But understanding, I'm like, all right, like how do we take a broader perspective of being like in the whole situation? And then becoming aware of like all the different things that you can do in terms of your own communication, your own emotions to ameliorate the situation, to a point where you're not angry anymore, like where you're just like kind of content, and then go from there. Like, all right, so what are the things that, anger me that, maybe this other person does, my coach does, my teammate does, that I can't control. So like your controllables and uncontrollables, and going from there and being able to be aware of those things and be like, yeah, every time my coach says that, it just really, really makes me mad. Doing the most that you can for yourself, and getting to that point of like, yep, my coach says that, I'm going to get kind of angry. But it's funny, from when I've talked to people who've kind of worked with this concept of tracking their emotions, a lot of people think that it's funny after they've been doing it for a couple of months when they say like, oh, that made me angry. They're like, actually, it didn't really make me angry. I'm like, I'm not actually angry about it anymore. It's just kind of funny. And so they see this like kind of trajectory of there's no real point of, certain emotional reactions. It's not helpful for them anymore. And even sports, some of my MMA fighters that I work with, even sports like that, where they're like, I don't fight with anger anymore because it's not helpful for me. They're like, it clouds my judgment. I don't see as clearly during the fight. And what I've noticed is like, the fights that I am angry, I usually, despite either whether I win or lose, I usually have a worse performance. My performance deteriorates because I'm like thinking I need to fight with anger and get all hyped. And he's a guy that I'm thinking about. He's like, no, the performances where I'm just aware of what's happening are the ones that I feel the best about, regardless of the scorecard. So that's kind of cool that, that's been his trajectory, to even, have such an aggressive sport as MMA fighting. And he was like, yeah, I don't actually get angry anymore. And it's kind of nice. So it's these weird perceptions, I think, that people think that they have to, respond a certain way, to get a desired result, but they don't. And as soon as they realize that, they're like, oh, that's a lot easier not doing that. So, yeah.
My final question to you, Danielle, before we wrap up the episode, is if you had to summarize what we've been speaking about today into one sentence for people to take away, what would that be?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Actually, not really. I would say slow down, disconnect, and find what works best for you and your emotions. So that'd be emotions and brain health. But yeah, so that'd be my biggest thing, is like, just slow down.
So once again, Danielle, thanks again for coming on the Mindset Athlete podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, the pleasure's been all mine. If you like this episode, please do share it with your friends, and do let Danielle and I know what you thought of the episode by tagging us over on Instagram at the Concussion Coach and at James O Roberts 11, And again, you can do the same on Twitter and Facebook. And finally, do check out her free symptom guide, which you can find on her Instagram at the Concussion Coach. And again, do check out my free content at fitamputee.co.uk/free-resources. Make sure to check those out. The links will be in the description. You can find all the show notes at mindsetgame.lipsum.com under the category Sport. So once again, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next week for another episode of the Mindset Athlete Podcast.